Okay, so in the second chunk, we are going to work on converting, which means change, each decimal to an equivalent fraction in simplest form. So we're given the decimal, and we want to know what it is as a fraction in simplest form. So here's our decimal. We would read this as 22 hundredths. So in word form, you'll see I have it as 22 hundredths. And if you draw a blank on that when we did our decimal review, we reviewed those rooms, and I have 0 holes, right? It looks like this. So this last digit is in the hundredths room. We would read it as 22 hundredths. So use that decimal chart if you need to. I believe it's glued in your notebook. All right, back to here. So how we read it is how we write it. If you look in your notes, very large above this chart, it says how you read it is how you write it. How do you read this decimal? 22 hundredths. That's how we write it. 22 hundredths. Now, is it simplified? No. We can use our divisibility rules. 22 is an even number. 100 is an even number. If we look at the last digit, remember the divisibility rule for 2? We can divide both of these by 2 to simplify it. 22 divided by 2, if you're not sure, you may use a calculator. That gives me 11. And 100 divided by 2, that gives me 50. Do 11 and 50 share a factor other than 1? No, they do not. So here's the simplest form. 22 hundredths in decimal form right here is equivalent to 11 fiftieths. See how we did that? Let's do the next one together. So how do we read this decimal? Well, if you're not sure, you could use your chart. We know we have a 1 in the ones place. So in my units here, it'd be 1. And then we have a 1 and a 5. So decimal point, 1 and a 5. I would read this as 1, remember what we say for the decimal point? And, what's that last room right there? Hundredths. So 1 and 15 hundredths. How you read it is how you write it. So 1 and 15 hundredths. Got that TH on there. That's how we write it here. So, or that's how we write it as a fraction. So 1 is my whole number, and I have 15 hundredths of a whole. Can we simplify this? We'll just cover up that whole number. Do 15 and 100 share a factor outside of 1? You bet they do. This one ends in a 5, this one ends in a 0. Remember your divisibility rule for 5? Has to end in a 5 or a 0. So I can divide both of these by 5. That leaves me with my whole number, which is still 1, and 15 divided by 5 is 3. 100 divided by 5 is 20. So 1 and 3/20 is the exact, or has the exact same value as this decimal. They are equivalent. So how do we go from a decimal form to a fraction form and keep it equivalent? We remember how you read it is how you write it. Let's move on to the next chunk. So moving on to the second chunk, first you need to fill in some pieces up here. So now we're going to go from a fraction to a decimal. Previously we went from a decimal to a fraction and remembered how you read it is how you write it. Well, now fractions, we have to recall this, are division problems. Do you remember that? Fraction bar is really just a division symbol. Divide the, fill this in, numerator by the denominator. So now we're going to convert. Convert just means to change. Our first fraction is 7/8. We need to divide the numerator by the denominator. So let's do that. If you don't have a calculator next to you, go ahead and find one. And let's use that to help us. So if I take the numerator, which is 7, and I divide it by the denominator, which is 8, I get 0.875. How would I read this? Well, if you still have your notebook by you, it was 875. What is that room that the last digit is in? Thousands. So 875 thousandths. that would be the equivalent decimal, 875 thousandths. Equivalent decimal to 7/8. So numerator divided by the denominator. Let's look at the next example. How are these two different? This is a mixed number. With this mixed number, just ignore the whole number for a moment. And let's go numerator divided by denominator. You can use your calculator again. So we want to go numerator. Don't make the mistake of going with the 8 first. Our numerator is 5, so 5 divided by 8 equals 625 thousandths. Now, if you were to just write this, would that be the correct decimal for this mixed number? No, because we have 2 and 625 thousandths. So our final answer is going to be 2 and 625 thousandths. That's why I gave you that little reminder. If you look below, it says don't forget your whole number. Okay. Let's do the next example. We have 4/9. So if we want to change 4/9 to an equivalent decimal, we're going to remember that fractions are really just division problems. So numerator divided by denominator. Type that in our calculator. 4 divided by 9. Whoa! What's different? It doesn't stop. This up here is a terminating decimal. See how there are no more digits back here? I mean, there are zeros, but no digits outside of 0 are back here. It stops. Same with this one. It stops. Does this stop? No. And actually, if our calculator was even had a wider screen, the 4s would keep going forever. This is what we call a repeated decimal. We have that in as a part of our vocabulary list. So let me fill this in here. 4 divided by 9. When we did that, we got 0.44. Do you want to sit here and write 4s for forever? I sure don't. So there's a symbol that we can use to represent digits that repeat. What digit repeats in this problem? Just the 4, right? So we can use a notation bar. That's a notation bar to show that this digit is what repeats in this decimal. And these two, this fraction and this decimal, are equivalent. 4/10 repeating is the same as 4/9. Let's do the next one. We have 1/11. You notice sometimes I write my fraction bar like this and sometimes I write it like this. It doesn't matter. So if I want to convert that to an equivalent decimal, I'm going to go 1 divided by 11. And I know that that feels goofy, right? Because you're doing the smaller number first, but numerator divided by denominator. So let's do this. On our calculator, 1 divided by 11. Huh, interesting. There's no whole number. 0.09090909, and that would actually continue on forever. So I don't want to sit here and write 0.09090909. So I'm going to ask myself, what digits repeat 0 and 9? So now my notation bar is going to go over both 0 and 9 since they both repeat. So that is how you convert a fraction to a decimal. You divide the numerator by the denominator.